everyone. It feels so momentous to be at this point. We actually had the kernel of this idea several years ago, and we were working up toward it, but then the pandemic hit, and everything was suspended for a long time. But first and foremost, I just want to really thank everyone at University of Maryland, Chris Bonner, and most especially Patrick, who anchored this event for the Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective. We're so pleased to have worked with so many of our partners. Many of you are here, just thank you so very much. So we wanted to actually give you an introduction to our syllabus project, and we'll go into more detail, but could we go to the next slide? So we wanted to begin by acknowledging the fact that several years ago, when we were initially thinking about reanimating a teaching project around the Korean War, we reached out to Hyun Lee. And Hyun Lee, when I first called her up and asked her if she would take part, she said, why? Why would I want to do that? And she asked that question. And she had a lot of suspicion about doing a project that intersected with the university. And we talked about it. And I said, Hyun, the university plays a critical role within the military-industrial academic complex. And those of us who are fighting to bring the Korean War to an end, we have to consider the significance of that role. And for those of us who are in the university, we need to organize where we're at. And I asked her if she would work with us to pass resolutions at national academic organizations that galvanized people within the academy to come on board. And she agreed. So Hyun was a major co-author of our initial resolution calling for a decolonizing end to the Korean War. And we passed that at the Association for Asian American Studies. We chose that location because that was the first national organization to support BDS. And we decided, and it's also an organization that has deep anti-imperialist commitments. And for that reason, we went there. And so we want to honor Hyun in also introducing you to our syllabus project. She passed away in 2022. And you could see her words here as well. These are words that she said about a comrade, and we feel that they so strongly apply to her as well. So one of the things that we knew that we were tasked with was how do we do a political educational initiative about the Korean War within the proverbial belly of the East. And we were thinking about Frantz Fanon. And Frantz Fanon spoke about how colonialism manifests itself in overt and brutal ways in the colonies. But in the metrical, education takes the form of bewilderment. And so we understood as our task, especially since very few of us studied anything at all about the Korean War in our formal education, we understood that our task against this bewilderment was the task of clarification. And we wanted to point out, too, that some of us, two of us in particular, Monica Kim and me, we were part of an earlier formation. In the wake of 9/11 and the United States nominating North Korea as part of the infamous trio, the Axis of Evil, there was an academic formation called the Alliance of Scholars Concerned About Korea. And a group of us came together, we would come together at various conferences, and we organized together, and we launched a teaching initiative. And it was a teaching initiative that we, on reflection, understand was very problematic. We knew at the time as well, but it was periodized from 2010 to 2013. And what happened was we basically came together to discuss putting on the books, and what we did succeed in doing is we got 80 academics, principally based in North America, to sign on to teach a class that was dedicated either in whole or in part to teaching the Korean War through a decolonizing lens. And when Monica and I were on this, we actually worked to get a number of Asian Americans on board. So it was a sort of combination of people who were within critical Asian studies, or who understood themselves to be in conversation with that formation, and also Asian American studies. And there were a number of major accomplishments. We had these national peace days, which we hosted on college campuses, but we almost always did so in conjunction with a community organization. So we hosted a number of these. We had speaker tours. We did a number of events. We had an entire national film screening of diasporas and Ramsey Lean's film, Memory of Forgotten War. And we took that on the road as well. And there also were tours in South Korea that looked at different sites through the lens of the unfinished Korean War, the unending Korean War. So you could see that JT Takagi was part of these as well. But we also realized that there are problems to this. This is a war that has not ended. Why did the teaching initiative come to an end? There was no public-facing component to it. There's no syllabus project. In the interval since the close of the first teaching initiative, there have been all these amazing online curricula, one example after another, and we took inspiration in those as well. And it was oftentimes anchored in university spaces, and it also, it was in conversation with ethnic studies and liberatory sort of methods, but it wasn't fundamentally committed to those. And so those were key differences. So in deciding to revamp a teaching initiative and one that included a syllabus project, we definitely reflected back on what we had done to think about what we would do differently this time around. So you can see that in June of 2020, as well as July of 2021, we passed resolutions calling for an end to the Korean War that included, as a commitment, an obligation to do anti-imperialist reflection on the centrality of the U.S. university to imperialist war violence around the globe. And first at the Association for Asian American Studies, and then at American Studies Association, which actually emerged in 1951. But when it emerged, it didn't have a single word to say about the Korean War, not at all. And one of the things that we have as an open invitation and a possibility is to do one of their freedom classes on the Korean War. And if that's something that you would like to be involved in, that's something that we can do down the road.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of overall framework and sort of conceptual framing that the syllabus sort of undertakes. And I think the primary one is to challenge the assumption that the war was bound by these traditional dates of 1950 and 1953. The end date obviously sort of dovetails with the overall sort of political goal of this project to bring about sort of a decolonizing end to the war, right? So I think in a lot of ways the first step towards that is sort of to understand that the chronology of the war, sort of the understanding of the war as a discrete event that ended, is the first thing that we sought to kind of challenge and have people engage with. So the first, I think, important concept that we try to get across in the syllabus is to challenge the sort of temporality of the war itself. And then in doing so, I think we also try to sort of seek to push the geographic boundaries as well, just as the impacts, legacies, as well as sort of origins of the war sort of transcend that 3-year period, so does sort of geographically speaking, the reach of the war, right? So I think Christine has mentioned the key role that the conflict played in the emergence of the US military industrial academic complex. It really was the Korean War that helped solidify the sort of a permanent war economy within the United States. We also sort of look at sort of regions that even sort of the scholarship is just beginning to sort of explore. The module that we'll be talking about includes sort of readings and questions that look at actors that most people don't think or assume took part in the war. So what is the role of Puerto Rican soldiers, for instance, in the Korean War? So challenging sort of the scalar boundaries as well as the temporal ones of the war is sort of the key overarching framework. And as I mentioned, sort of the ultimate aim is to bring about an end to the war, and that's why we kind of wanted to center this project as not just an academic or scholarly one, but one of political education. I think one of the things that most excited me about this teaching collective was that it was explicitly sort of designed to reach not only sort of students and academics on university campuses, but activists and people sort of who might not otherwise have any interest in the Korean War itself, right? So I think in sort of the materials that we choose, as well as the people that we engage with. So as you'll see in the second session, we have not only sort of traditional academics, but sort of people involved in activist organizations sort of taking part in this larger effort. And I think it's sort of important to sort of build this sort of critical mass for sort of discussing and sort of reorienting sort of the popular understanding of the Korean War itself, and sort of how it wasn't just a discrete event for 3 years on the Korean Peninsula, but part of a larger sort of system of US imperialism and militarism. And this syllabus, we sort of also wanted to kind of, in sort of expanding the boundaries of the Korean War, also wanted to sort of invite conversations, collaborations with other groups. Sort of the idea of doing a public syllabus project was very much inspired by similar syllabus projects like the Standing Rock or the Sanctuary syllabi that are available online. And we very much see ourselves in conversation with these various groups and various conversations. And I think one of our main goals is to sort of highlight the linkages between the Korean War and these other struggles. And finally, I kind of wanted to end by sort of highlighting some of the key questions that sort of are threaded throughout the various modules within the syllabus. The syllabus is organized around thematic modules. However, I think some of these questions listed on this slide are sort of the ones that sort of provide sort of through thread through all of the different modules. The first one, as has been made clear, is what does a decolonizing and de-imperializing end to the Korean War look like? And then the question that we're going to be examining in more detail today is sort of the geographic reach of the Korean War beyond the Korean Peninsula, and what does it mean to understand structural violence on sort of intimate registers on multiple geographic scales. Right, so not just thinking about sort of the top-down sort of narratives that often sort of characterize our discussions of the Korean War or other conflicts, but sort of what or the personal stories that came out of the conflict. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sangin.
This is going to be at the end of the presentation as well, but we actually have a detour of the National Mall planned for tomorrow, starting at 12 p.m. At the World War II Memorial, and we'll be going to the Vietnam War Memorial, the Martin Luther King's Memorial, and the Korean War Memorial to problematize how the public consecration of, in the kind of national spaces of the National Mall and how problematic that is, and we'll be revamping it and retaking it over with the kind of more intimate register and the people who actually suffered through all these different wars and violences throughout contemporary American history. So I hope many of you can join us. So I want to talk about methods, especially because I'm a historian, and methods to the Korean War, as well as methods, and how can we think about new methods into doing a kind of political education that has transformative ends that are decolonial, de-imperializing, as Kwon Sing-chun would put it. And I want us to, I'll come back to this artwork, but I want us to kind of seep in and think about this artwork by Young-Sun Min, who was an amazing comrade of our collective, and this phenomenal work, especially the one on the left, right? I want you to kind of soak in the usage of her own body, the engravings, right? And how these important dates in modern Korean history are not in a linear fashion that neatly falls from one to the other, right? But they're kind of spiraling into its original sin, so to speak, which is the Korean War and the occupation. And we'll come back to this. And I think it's really important to think about other types of methods and other types of archives. Especially for me as a historian, I've spent years in the just adjacent national archives, copying and photocopying 100,000s of pages literally. But there are things that will never come out from public records, military documents, and from the U.S. state archives. And if you really kind of think about how actually just by digging up archive in the kind of conventional historians mode, so to speak, reproduces the very colonial logic and structures that are inherent to these archives, right? So how can we actually think about alternative methods to doing a kind of education and research that has a transformative ends and changes, right? And so our syllabus is really aimed at this kind of multiple study spaces, from organized study spaces, outside of the traditional classroom of the university, to self-study of students, or at when you're doing community work, you're going out as a college student, for instance, to the local community to do after-school tutoring and teaching, as I've done when I was an undergraduate student. We really want you to take the full use of our syllabus that incorporates a wide range of materials that are not just academic articles that are published or book chapters, but we have films, documentaries, comic books, artworks, political artworks that are eye-opening. And so this is something that I would like to highlight, and I think will be further, and as Junyoung explains our critical geographies module, this will become more apparent. But let's actually consider this artwork by Young-Sun Min. This poster shows an image of a heavily shadowed naked female body with writing covering the arms, chest, and stomach. The arm on the left has the word occupied written from the shoulder down to the wrist. The arm on the right, likewise, has a word territory. Written across the chest is a word heartland, and 4 dates spiral out from the navel: 1953, April 19, 1960, May 19, 1980, and April 29, 1992. And additionally, the picture is a bit small. There's a stanza of type printed over the image reading. It reads, open quote, "My body lies over the ocean. My body lies over the sea. My body lies over the DMZ. Oh, bring back my body to me. Bring back, oh, bring back my body to me." In Defining Moments of 1992, a 6-part photographic ensemble, Min intentionally conflates these crucial dates and moments in Korean history with her own life by etching significant dates and words on photographs of her own body. So this image presents a commingled history through a series of dates spiraling out of her belly. The chain begins with 1953, the year of Min's birth, which coincided with the so-called the end of the Korean War. We then encounter April 19, 1960, the date of the popular uprising that overthrew Seungman-ri's dictatorship in South Korea, which made it possible for Min's family to leave the country. Then May 19, 1980, the date of Gwangju uprising and massacre, in which many students were killed, an experience that politicized the young Min. And finally, April 29, 1992, Min's birthday, the date that riots in central Los Angeles destroyed much of Koreatown, and the date that motivated her to produce these defining moments. Right? So, I mean, you can see just by thinking through this artwork that the Korean War and the legacies of having, it's not a legacy, right? The continued US occupation of Korea and its presence in Korea has a profound effect that goes well beyond the Korean peninsula, that is at the heart of our module that we're launching today, the critical geographies of Korea. How can we think about the Korean War beyond just the geographic proximity to the Korean peninsula, right? How can we think about this body to rethink about separation, division, and partition, not just at the geographic location of the DMZ, but through the bodies that are depicted in the adoption, the transnational adoption, separated families, the military brides, the mixed race, the intergenerational legacies, the DMZ that's in the Korean diaspora, and the politics of memory and belonging that still haunt us today. And I don't want to spend too much on Korean War historiography, but the Korean War is perhaps one of the most studied aspects of the Korean history, modern contemporary history. But for such a long time during the Cold War, much of the scholarship has been about blame attribution and finding out or digging up new state archives to see what is the latest thing that we can find to point finger at one or the other, right? So, this kind of stereotypical blaming that, it was North Korea that triggered the war, or it was Kim Il-sung asking for consent to invade the South with Mao Zedong or with Stalin, right? And even as the so-called left revisionism that was spearheaded by historians, by the likes of Bruce Cummings and John Holliday, we were still kind of confined in this kind of binary, right, and proximity, and the kind of a war that is over there, a hot war and a civil war, right, but a war that was still over there that we as Americans, or perhaps as Asian Americans, it was a separate kind of a matter, right? And I think beginning in the 1990s with the so-called demolition of the Cold War, formal structures of the Cold War, we have scholars like Kun Sing Chen who starts to bring out, how can we do a kind of a critical Asian humanities and I guess critical Korean studies, in fact, and where we do a kind of a a study that is to a de-Cold War, de-imperializing, and de-Cold War ends, right? And we really have to think about this. It's sort of a very important moment in which the repressed stories of people, varying from comfort women who couldn't speak about the atrocities that they faced, right? Throughout the Cold War period, they were able to come out for the first time, so to speak, right? But even as Kun-Sing Chen has pointed us to this really intriguing way of doing a critical Asian humanities, right? The question of how can we actually achieve those goals has really never been so clear. But I think, in the more recent turn of critical ethnic studies and Korean diaspora studies that you can, find from scholars like Jody Kim to Alina Kim and Grace Cho, among others, you really have this kind of interdisciplinary and multiscalar and intersectional and structural critique of the Korean War that shows militarized violence, that reveals something that's very profound at the intimate level, that's not just restricted to the Korean Peninsula, but far-reaching and beyond. And so I really want to emphasize that both our public syllabus modules and our efforts as a collective is part and parcel with this kind of expansion of how do we expand the materials and how do we expand our methods, building on these array of scholarships that have grown over the year, from the interventional pretext to the new left revisionism, to Kun-Sing Chen's Asia as method, to the more recent and growing field of critical ethnic studies and Korean diasporic studies. And I think I've done enough of the introducing of the syllabus. So we do want to let you know that we have a series of other modules that are being launched as well. We've started with our reverberations of the Korean War module, which is launched in August 2022 at UC Santa Cruz. And you'll find some really interesting modules that fall beneath this reverberations of the Korean War, like our module on the Vietnam War, our module on the militarized kinship, and there's a total of 8 modules. And so please check them out. If you scan our QR code at the end of the presentation, you'll be able to access them on our Korea Policy Institute website, which is easily accessible by typing in Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective on Google. And of course, we are today launching our critical geographies of the Korean War, and we will also be launching our Race and the Korean War module on an online session at Yale University in the spring of 2025. With that, I will hand over the mic to Junyoung. Thank you.
So today I'm going to introduce our new module, and hopefully it's going to be online sooner than later. So it's a trailer. I'm presenting you with the trailer, and I promise the film is better than the trailer. So the critical geographies on Unending Korean War. So you probably looked at the session and you saw the subtitle From Pyongyang to Vieques, and you're wondering, why? What is the relation between Pyongyang and Vieques? Well, that is what I'm going to show you. So precisely there's syllabus is anchored around 2 main questions. And the first one is precisely the relation between area and race, or geopolitics and biopolitics. And the question that we ask is, what are the connections between the creation of racialized humanity and the construction of area? Area as a target of military intervention, capitalist extractivism, humanitarian initiatives, and academic study. And precisely this question is fundamental. And I look at two citations. We could have looked at more, but I think these are fundamental citations precisely in critical Korean studies and critical Korean war studies. And the first comes from Christine Hong's path-breaking book, A Violent Peace. And I quote here, "The militarized practices of racial profiling and area targeting are critical to the undemocratic exercise of U.S. police and war practices predicated on the lethal conflation of racialized humanity with a suspect terrain that refuse differentiation on the level of the individual while generating," quote from Wilson Gilmore's Golden Goulash, "group differentiated vulnerability to premature death," unquote. Now, this is fundamental because it's saying precisely what Christine is saying here is racial profiling presumes guilt not just by association, but location. And this is precisely what collateral damage implies, right? It's a nexus between area and race, right? And we can see how this is embodied not just in the U.S. war overseas, but also U.S. domestic wars against racialized populations. And the other quote comes from Ray Chow's The Age of the World Target, and I quote, "The truth of the continual targeting of the world is a fundamental form of knowledge production. Area studies is xenophobia. The inability to handle the otherness of the other beyond the orbit that is a bomber's own visual path. For this xenophobe, every effort needs to be made to sustain and secure this orbit. That is, by keeping the place of the other as target always filled." And this argument problematizes the very modus operandi of area studies. So we speak about not just the military-industrial complex, but the military-industrial academic complex. And this is fundamental. Because I think a lot of times the university would critique colonialism, imperialism, but it fails to critique itself, right? And this is fundamental because precisely area studies, where the U.S. is the knowing subject, is also the position of the bomber, right? Which is why areas can be only targets, whether they're objects of study or objects of other intervention. And since an area must always be an isolated, limited target, it is impossible within this area studies framework to actually see relations between areas or overlapping areas, such as in the case of Korea and Latin America, which I will speak about soon. And this is precisely why Korea and Latin America becomes forgotten geographies, right? It cannot be seen or understood in the epistemically closed orbit of area studies. And moreover, the nexus between area and race points to the racial unconscious of area studies, in which the fetishization of area hinges on a disavowal of its own investment in race. Right? Yes, if I have a beef about area studies, I really do. All right. So, and the next one is precisely what my Sung-eun and has been speaking about, and also Patrick, is the multiscalar geographies of the Korean War. And I take another amazing piece of artwork from Young Sun-min. And when we see here is how the political events are overlapping precisely in the geography of her body, right? And so when we think about geographies, it's not just different locations within the map, but also different scales. And what I mean by scales is not necessarily placing one hierarchy in another, but the ways that, for example, the intimate, the corporeal, and the granular, right, converge with the imperialist, the territorial, and the ecological. So the Korean War is not only spatially manifested through geopolitical infrastructures of war, capital, and empire, but also at the level of the granular, by disciplining the most intimate and most quotidian, right? The body, sexuality, affect, such as sound, touch, and taste, right? The often heard history of the Korean War is that people think the Korean War tastes like cornbread, tastes like chocolate, right? Takes like that, and this is fundamental to thinking precisely about geographies. So with not much further ado, I am going to introduce precisely the submodule of this module, right? Which is entitled Korea, Latin America, Forgotten Geographies of the Korean War. And yes, this has a lot of text, but I will read it because I think it's important. So on June 13th, 2002, two teenage girls near a U.S. military base in Uijeongbu, Korea, were killed by a vehicle in a U.S. Army convoy. 5 months later in Vieques, a little girl on the island died of cancer caused by U.S. nuclear testing, which had been conducted in Vieques since the 1940s. These tragedies, a few among a countless many, sparked ongoing demonstrations demanding the removal of U.S. military bases on both sides of the Pacific. In fact, these intimate trans-Pacific connections are part and parcel of the geographic reach of the unending Korean War. the Korean War was a watershed in Latin American, Latinx, Chicanx participation in the US military. The 6,000 soldiers of the 65th Infantry, an all-volunteer Puerto Rican regiment of the United States known as the Borinqueneers, the Colombian Battalion, largely made up of forcibly recruited Afro-Colombian men, and Chicano soldiers from Texas and California. Additionally, most, if not all, Korean migration to Latin America since 1950 can be traced to the Korean War and its reverberations. Indeed, the first Korean immigrants to arrive in South America were North Korean prisoners of war who chose to relocate to a third non-aligned country. When South Korea began to send migrants to South America in the 1960s, these former POWs became the nucleus of these Korean diaspora communities. Although Korean migration to Latin America is most often read as labor migration, that has little to do with war, it is important to see these waves of migration in relation to the permanent nature of the Korean War, that is, as militarized diaspora. Remembering Latin America as part of the geography of the Korean War subverts not only the war's putative spatial dimension, but also its temporal periodization. Indeed, the Korean War was marked by an imperial governmentality whose dominant logics have operated and continue to do so in and on Latin America since at least the mid-19th century, their flexible combination of settler imperial tactics and capitalist domination. So you can think about, for example, the United Fruit Company. The history and infrastructure of U.S. settler imperialism unfolds, builds upon, and continues transoceanically. The Pacific as from indigenous dispossession in the Americas, and Latin America as empire's workshop, to the Pacific as a U.S. experimental war laboratory, back to the counterinsurgency low-intensity warfare conducted in Latin America throughout the 1970s and 80s, and now to the war on terror in the Middle East. This circuitous spatial and temporal cartography of U.S. empire demands that we examine the forgotten geographies of the Korean War. So some of the keywords here precisely is the laboratory of empire, right? So there's different laboratories and scenarios, and this becomes translated, refashioned, redeployed in different circumstances, which precisely is why it's a networked empire, it's a circuitous empire. We generally think about empires as having like a start date and end date, you know, there's one here, one there, but it's actually much more complex than that, right? And the other words that I wanted to kind of highlight are dirty wars, right? In Latin America, we speak a lot about la guerra sucia, you know? And the dirty war is actually not a war, right? It's more of a genocide. It's a massacre, the state against the people, right? And this is precisely what the Korean War was, right? And a lot of the wars that are actually called wars were state violence, right? And imperial violence against people. So some of the questions that we want to propose, the first one is, why has Latin America or Latin Americans been forgotten in the dominant study and institutionalized state memory of the Korean War? And how would unearthing and centering these histories, experiences, and memories question, complicate, and refract narratives of the Korean War? The second, what are the connections between U.S. imperial policy in Korea and U.S. neocolonial rule of Latin American countries? And we could even think about debt imperialism, right? The 1997 Asian financial crisis, along with the financial crisis in the 1980s to the 2001 Argentine financial crisis. Third, how does the infrastructure of U.S. empire and war not only connect unlikely spaces, for example, the Puerto Rican island and the Korean peninsula, but also the bodies and lives of racialized subjects, including Latin American, Latinx, and Chicanx soldiers, and Korean military workers? Four, how did the Korean War provide the necessary biopolitical and geopolitical conditions for the territorial and labor extraction of Latin American ecologies and peoples? Right, and this is a fundamental question. Why did the Korean War become the watershed for this moment? And five, what is the connection between the dominant cartographical imaginary of the Korean War and the ways in which we normalize the destinations and routes that most often counted in imaginings of the Korean diaspora? So to kind of spell that out, for example, when we think about Korean diaspora, it's usually the North American Korean diaspora. So even the Korean word, for example, kyopo, which could mean overseas Koreans in many different places, is actually kind of synonymous to Korean Americans or Korean US Americans. So why do we not think about, for example, the Korean diaspora in Latin America or the North Korean diaspora in Europe, for instance? Someone explained very well the kind of decolonial and the de-imperial and demilitarized importance of methods, right? And especially in my study, historical archives are actually, fractured, right? They're most characterized by absence or erasure, or when they're only statistics or it's narrative of the state, right? The Colombian state is proud that it served in the U.S. Imperial War. And in this case, I think it's fundamental to think precisely of other modes of knowledge. And this is where I take Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation, right, in Venus in Two Acts. So a narrative of what could have been, right? And this is crucial precisely in this work. Another important part is how, in many times when we think about knowledge production in the U.S. academy, we automatically prioritize English language texts, right? And in the work, obviously, of Latin America and Korea, or Korean Latin America, the majority of these texts are not translated, right? And the publication of Latin American literature still follows the imperial route, speaking of multiple empires. So the major publishing houses of Spanish language texts are still based in Spain, right? Which is why the local, for example, the Mexican, the Argentine, the Chilean, etc., most often just publish a few texts, and they mostly go out of print. So the text that I'm looking at in terms of the study materials are. So one of the first ones that I want to look at is Emilio Diaz-Valcarcel's short stories, which are called El Soldado Damián Sánchez, Private Damián Sánchez, En Proceso en Diciembre, which is called The Trial in December. These texts have not been translated. Hopefully I will get a chance to translate them. So these two short stories by Puerto Rican writer Emilio Diaz-Valcarcel are actually fictional stories based on his own experience in the 65th Regiment of the U.S. Army during the Korean War. And as I mentioned earlier, right, this is the first time where there's an all-out Puerto Rican regiment in the U.S. Army, most of them directly from the island of Puerto Rico. This is at the time that intersects with what's called the Great Migration in Puerto Rican studies, when Puerto Ricans migrate to the U.S., right, especially to New York. So in December of 1954, a year and a half after the signing of the Korean Armistice Agreement, 162 Puerto Ricans of the 65th Infantry were arrested on allegations of breaches of military discipline. So out of these arrested, 95 soldiers were court-martialed, and 91 were found guilty and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 1 to 18 years of hard labor. So under the pretext of increasing combat productivity and integrating soldiers, the U.S. military replaced the officer staff of the 65th Infantry with white Anglo officers. This is sometime in 1952-1953. So dissatisfied with the conduct and performance of the Puerto Rican regiment, the new colonel in charge issued orders, which included the following, right? And this is precisely biopolitical disciplining, right? So the unit was to stop calling itself Buccaneers. The rations of rice and beans were to be cut. Spanish was to be prohibited, and that soldiers were to shave off their mustaches. Right? So this resulted in the Puerto Rican soldiers questioning their role and status in the U.S. empire as well as the U.S. Military. So these short stories precisely talk about this unknown part of history of the Korean War. This Puerto Rican soldiers establishing the Puerto Rican flag in the Korean War, during the Korean War. The other, again, untranslated, very minor literature is Jose Revueltas' Cain's Motives, right? And it was out of print for many years and only recently actually came back to print in Mexico City. So he was a Mexican Marxist writer and activist, Jose Revueltas. He was one who had been imprisoned at Isla Maria twice for his political activism. And his minor novel, very short one, but it shuttles between Los Angeles, Tijuana, and Korea, tracing the connections between the U.S. conquest of Mexico, U.S. systematic racism, indigenous dispossession in the United States and Mexico, anti-Asian racism in Mexico, and U.S. atrocities during the Korean War. So in this novel, the story is based around this protagonist called Jack Mendoza, who's a Chicano soldier who deserts the U.S. Army while serving in the Korean War after a very traumatic experience when he's ordered to torture a North Korean soldier of part Mexican heritage. Okay, this sounds very complicated. I'll spell this out. So in this, what is this novel, right? They imprison this other, which is called Kim Won, and he actually turns out to be a North Korean soldier who's born to a Mexican mother and Korean father, and joins the North Korean army because of his own communist beliefs, right? So in order to portray that Jack Mendoza's loyalty to the U.S. Army, he's forced to torture this North Korean soldier. So in the novel, what's really interesting is the most abject other, the North Korean soldier, turns out to be part of oneself. He's none other than a fellow Mexican, right? Precisely questioning this breach of enemy-foe, right? This idea, obviously, of racialization within the context of the Korean War and also Mexican nation-state. The other novel, actually, I only found out at doing this work that it had been translated in 1989 to be out of print, but you can actually still find it like a copy if you search. And this is Manuel Zapata Oliveira's Champoco Corral de Negros. Manuel Zapata Oliveira was an Afro-Colombian writer and anthropologist, very much kind of a counterpart of people like Aimé Césaire, right, the Negritude movement. And in this novel, which is translated as Chambaco Black Slums, which takes its name from Afro-diaspora community outside Cartagena. So the novel powerfully illustrates the genocidal state violence against, as well, the quotidian erasure and marginalization of Afro-Colombian people in a country that constantly denies existence of the black communities despite having the third largest Afro-descent population in the Americas. And this study is also very important thinking about the Black Pacific, because the region where the Afro-Colombian population are mostly found is precisely what's called La Región Pacífico, right? The Pacific region, where there's what's called departamentos, different states, where there's 80 to 90% are Afro-Colombian population. And it's precisely also the poorest and most underdeveloped region in Colombia, and largely also a victim of displacement by like the narco wars and state violence. So thinking precisely about the Black Pacific is part and parcel of the geographies of the Korean War. So in this novel, so the first scene of the novel actually opens with a military invasion of the Afro-Colombian community of Chambacu. And the military attempts to violently impress men to fight in the Korean War, a war in which they have no investment. So one of the protagonists is actually tortured when he refuses enlistment. So this is, again, another part of the way that genocidal violence works on double fronts, right? So to cleanse the country of Afro-Colombians by sending them to this imperial war, where Colombia and the U.S. are bedfellows within the Cold War order. And this Afro-Colombian soldiers in the Korean War. And the last kind of suggested material that I want to speak about is Lee Mung-soon's documentary, Good Light, Good Air. So the title of Lee Mung-soon's documentary brings the two overlapping histories of Gwangju, which literally means good light, and Buenos Aires, meaning good air. So on April 30th, 1977, 14 mothers sent a letter asking the military dictator, Jorge Rafael Videla, for the whereabouts of their disappeared children, and began together in protest in the Plaza de Mayo, Buenos Aires. And they became known as the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, or the mothers of Plaza de Mayo. This spurred a mass movement that continues today. So around the same time, on May 18th, 1980, citizens of Gwangju, South Korea, launched a mass resistance movement against the military dictatorship of Chun Doo-hwan. Right? So the South Korean military retaliated in full force, resulting in the massacre and disappearance of thousands of Gwangju citizens. So the documentary brings to light the mirroring the histories of Argentina and South Korea that were both global South countries violently conscripted into dirty wars against communism. The missing in Gwangju and the desaparecidos, or the disappeared in Buenos Aires, attest to the haunting presence and continuation of war and violence. And in this documentary, it very much explores these geographical sites. And what's really fascinating about this is that in South Korea, the genocidal violence is mostly illustrated by the bombing and destruction of buildings, or what can be called forensic architecture, following the geographer Eli Weizmann in his study of Palestine. But in Latin America, what has happened is actually the construction and the modernization of these cities. So literally, upon dead bodies were constructed malls, highways, soccer stadiums. So if you go to Buenos Aires or go to Santiago, Chile, right, you can do a whole tour of the city where there lay dead bodies. And you go to a mall, and this actually, if you tear up the walls, these are all that disappeared on the walls of this mall and the soccer stadium. So I want to leave it at that. And if you have any questions, obviously, we can raise them in discussion.
Junyoung, thank you so much. You know, I wanted to say that this incredible, really powerful presentation that Junyoung just did was essentially a walkthrough of a sub-module of the critical geographies section of the Ending the Korean War syllabus, and this will be up on our site, on the KPI website. So each of our modules, and they will vary because we have other types of modules coming up, including one on solidarities, but the modules generally begin with a kind of introduction, a critical analysis that introduces you to the submodule. That is followed by key terms, and then critical questions. So if you are doing this in some kind of political education setting, you can use those critical questions in application to the materials. And each of the materials, not only is there a listing of a range of different types of materials, and we were actually, Guåhan told us, don't assign full books. No one wants to read full books. But we took that to heart. And so we took sections, and in addition to listing them, we've annotated the materials. So if you're like, well, what's that about? That there will be a drop-down function, and by clicking on that, you can actually read about the work. And so this is just the way things are. Oh, did you want to?
And I just want to add
Sure.
that just like I curated Young Sung Min's piece, there's always an anchoring image that's not just for decoration, but it's actually something saying something profound about the topic, and so it's part of it's on all of our submodules.
Yes, and so this syllabus is very much a living project. Even the module that we started with, reverberations of the war, we decided very deliberately to begin with the unending of the war and the persistence and the manifestations of unending war in the present. And so even that is subject to revision, but this will be our moving into a second module. And we're going to take our time. This project has no end date in sight, and we welcome collaboration. Oh, sorry. Okay, we welcome collaboration with all of you. So for my part, my module is far less constructed, but I just wanted to walk you. But it's also quite old. So this kind of work, thinking about North Korea as target, is work that I did in earnest well over a decade ago, and so I'm just going to revisit some of that. Whenever we think about North Korea as target, it seems as though there's a kind of, there's some kind of perceptual apparatus of the war machine that perceives North Korea, and that North Korea independently exists from the war machine. But North Korea as target is really North Korea in scare quotations, right? It's in scare quotes. And when you think about the fact that the United States and South Korea perform numerous war exercises on an annual basis, some of the largest, if not the largest in the world, and that these war operations are not just, okay, is everyone able to fire their weapons? Let's do live fire drills. It's not just that. There are numerous other components that involve, for example, the flying of U.S. stealth bombers, which ostensibly you can't perceive. But when someone like Barack Obama is like, as part of our war exercises, we're going to fly stealth bombers, and announces that, it sort of unveils what otherwise couldn't be perceived. And what's the purpose of this? It's all part of a landscape of ongoing war. And so North Korea knows that it's on notice. It knows that it's being targeted, and it's being targeted for nuclear annihilation. And these apocalyptic plans to utterly destroy North Korea go back to North Korea's earliest emergence. And the United States has on repeated occasions threatened North Korea with total extermination, and even through conventional bombing means utterly destroyed North Korea, so much so that North Korea had to develop infrastructure underground. When we think about people developing infrastructure underground, oftentimes that's labeled terrorist, but isn't that actually the clearest sign that asymmetrical warfare and aerial mastery over the skies has been perpetrated against those people? And so within these war exercises, the United States routinely, I mean, these are it's COINTELPRO in terms of foreign policy. It's counterintelligence that's mobilized. And North Korea as target is, there are exercises, and these are virtual in nature. So North Korea's target is very much a virtual construction that is put into play by the very imperial power that places North Korea in the crosshairs of its war machine. And so it's mobilized into existence as a target through virtual means. And in these war exercises, the United States, along with South Korea, and also trilaterally, also with Japan, envisions North Korea not only as a zone of future occupation, so not only a simulated invasion, but occupation in North Korea. And it also imagines, and this is also a COINTELPRO strategy, the decapitation of North Korea's leadership. It also envisions a nuclear strike against Pyongyang. I mean, if you think about the geographic distance between the capitals of North and South Koreas, you realize that any kind of nuclear operational plan that the United States has in place for North Korea by default means the destruction of the South Korean people. It means the destruction of U.S. allies, Japan. It means the destruction of vast swaths of China. And even though Lindsey Graham said that, oh, well, that would be over there, not here, nuclear fallout travels. And the atomic bombs that the United States deployed on Japan in the middle part of the 20th century are child's play compared to the nuclear arms that the United States possesses today. So I just wanted to say something which is really going back to an earlier historical moment, that the function of war is to deterritorialize. It's to undo the sovereignty of the enemy, to transform the enemy into a target according to the logic, and here borrowing from Ray Chow, whom Jun Young cited earlier, the logic of seeing as destroying, to see with the intention to destroy. And through this mode of perception, to undo the enemy territory, and I put this in quotation marks, from within. And so what does it mean from within with regard to North Korea? The CIA routinely states that North Korea remains its most intractable black hole globally. So what does it mean for the United States to undo North Korea from within when the United States doesn't have a reliable perch from within? And so what does it mean to be a North Korea watcher? So here, this is Donald Rumsfeld. This is an infamous photo. It comes from an October 11th, 2006 press conference. And of course, you can imagine, what Donald, you can just fill in the caption. He's speaking about, here's an area that's totally dark, and making it seem as though the darkness is something associated with some sort of intrinsic evil, rather than the effect of U.S. war policy, including extraordinarily punitive sanctions. But by contrast, the South is bright. And so really extolling the sort of neoliberal prospects of the South. and the fact that North Korea remains a kind of war target. And he stated infamously during this time that, it's no coincidence that North Korea is lined up alongside Iran and Iraq, as part of the axis of evil, and that the United States is fully capable of waging a two-front war. And this is what he said during this press conference. And so this image, I think, really asks us to ask ourselves the question, and this is one of the critical questions that I pose: how do we understand the way that sight operates within imperialist warfare? How do we understand the ways in which it operates in counterinsurgent and counter-revolutionary intelligence regimes? And sight really is unthinkable outside the assumption of penetrative violence. So let me go to. So I'm sorry to bring this up because I know it's kind of dated, but I think it's useful. So here's Colin Powell. And here's Colin Powell in 2002 at the United Nations making the case for U.S. war in Iraq. You could see this kind of pattern of pretext from the Korean War, but even actually earlier, but from at least the Korean War onward. And he argued supposedly an evidentiary basis for Iraq possessing weapons of mass destruction. And he mobilized two forms of intelligence that were supposedly rock solid, right? And one was defector testimony, which in intelligence circles you would call human, and the other one was satellite images, which in intelligence circles you would call IMINT. And those two play off each other. Defectors caption the satellite images. They caption photographs. They bring those images don't speak for themselves. Their meaning is mobilized through the application of a defector sort of caption onto that image. And so I wanted to say that, and that's the quotation from the Ray Chow, thinking about North Korea as target, that there are these, we have to understand the act of seeing or perception or watching, North Korea watching, as a mode of perception that's essential to a militarized epistemology that fundamentally aims to destabilize North Korea as a sovereign nation. And when I was doing this work initially, and it wasn't work that I was trained to do, and it certainly wasn't in the field in which I was, I was actually in literature at Berkeley, that was my grad school education. Although I think, actually, Youngju, you asked a really interesting question back in the day of Pek Nok Chung, and you said, what's the significance of your literary training? And I think that there is something about interpretation that is potentially useful. But Mark Selden, who of Japan Focus, or Asia Pacific Journal, he asked me back then, he said, well, what about, instead of looking at this, what about North Korea's truths? So he was asking a kind of somewhat positivistic question. But I was really interested in this moment about writing about the perceptual apparatus of the war machine. And I really think that when it comes to intelligence, it's never about facts. Okay, it's never about something that we could agree upon as having some kind of truth value. Intelligence is really about domination or dominion. It's about superiority on the terrain of information. And so when people are saying oh, wow, with Colin Powell, his testimony before the UN, that really was a stain on an otherwise decent career. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. He was waging information warfare, and he succeeded. Okay. So I want to say, too, that it's through the gun sights of the world's most formidable nuclear war machine that we have been trained to view North Korea. You see this? And so, it's, I think, sobering to realize that in the middle part of the 20th century, North Korea had 400,000 occupants. The United States dropped 420,000 bombs on North Korea, more than one per person. I always state that this is the very definition of overkill. And it was utterly decimated. There's nothing left standing. Civilian infrastructure, in a violation of international humanitarian law, was deliberately targeted. And what was at play here was performative sight. You often hear that in South Korea, the kids of missionaries who were serving as part of the national security state, it was basically Korea's equivalent of China hands, that they would designate certain trouble spots in the south as red regions. And these areas became red regions quite literally through their targeting. They were awash in the blood of the people. North Korea was viewed as a giant red region, and it too was awash in the blood of its people. It's not that it was red, therefore dead. It was, let's bomb the hell out of this, because the entire notion of the area targeted expanded during the Korean War. So you could understand that with the hugest sort of permission for a margin of death that would be called collateral damage. So it was not red, therefore dead. It's dead, therefore probably red, but who cares, right? So Jenny Kelly, in her research on short-term political tourism in Palestine, speaks, and she's citing Edward Said here, how Palestinians don't have the permission to self-narrate on the global stage. And with regard to North Korea, it's not as though any emissary that North Korea sends out into the international arena is heard. Instead, the epistemology of enmity really conditions who gets to speak. And defector intelligence speaks for North Korea while it undermines North Korean sovereignty. Thank you so much. And so North Korean defectors are routinely marshaled to speak against North Korea's right to sovereignty, its right to self-defense, and its right to self-narrate. In the name of human rights, we have heard them advocate for fortified sanctions that reliably will produce humanitarian catastrophe, and they've even advocated for nuclear war in the name of human rights. And so here, we can think about Ava Horn's quotation, "The task of intelligence is to penetrate forbidden and protected space, cross borders, investigate the enemy's territory. This space is by definition uncharted, secret-filled, and necessarily dangerous." And so I just wanted to, I'm going to end shortly, and I'm sorry, I'll end shortly, but let me just say that these are handheld testimonies. North Korea is a major region for the National Endowment for Democracy, which is almost entirely congressionally funded. And, the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, likes to use these terms of democracy to be able to justify basically fascistic foreign policy. So it uses terms like citizen spies, like, hey, just join in, okay? Democratized intelligence. Let's all use liberation technology. Hey, Google Earth. So let's burst the prison world of North Korea asunder. And you know what? we have the right to omniscience. So like the sense that like we have the right to sort of penetrate the entire globe. And I think it's really laughable that one of the key works here was David Hawk. He was with Amnesty International. It was The Hidden Gulag. And this work came out shortly after 9/11. It was held to be landmark. And you could see it's this like lethal pairing of defector testimony and satellite photographs. And there's this term hidden, as though there's something sort of furtive or prurient, you know, like inviting you into a sort of forbidden zone. But there's very little hidden about this, and there's very little evidentiary about this too. The truths of North Korea that are manifested through this combination of human and image, these truths have been materialized into being through intelligence. And in fact, there was this sort of rabid anti-communist senator named Sam Brownback who stated that perhaps all of the evils of Camp 22, this like labor camp in North Korea, are fictions. He admitted this. He said, perhaps they're all fictions. He said, but North Korea had to expose itself, and it had a stark choice. It could either be transparent or it would face extinction. So on this hypothetical notion that Camp 22 existed, North Korea had to either fully expose itself to the US war machine or face extinction. And I just want to say this is one of the methods that we could use, going back to something that someone said. So there's North Korea watching. But why don't we watch the watcher? Why don't we make that a practice? So here we have Josh Stanton, who what has a very interesting history. He was part of the U.S. Army in terms of legal counsel when those two girls, Misun and Hyosun, were crushed. In 2002, he defended the U.S. military. And he served in Homeland Security. He now serves in FEMA. And he maintained this blog called One Free Korea, where he started to like take out a bunch of activists, right? He tried to take them out. He advocated that people get poked with sticks and cages and things along these lines. And he basically stated that he mapped Camp 25. And he said that he used Google Earth, and he talked to friends, contacts, and other people on the internet. And this is what he said. He said that he was scouring the hills north of Cheongjin, and then he found an enclosed compound. And in his intuitive take, it was a likely penitentiary. So then he talked to some people, and they didn't have anything. He talked to some of the people in Barbara Demick's work, Nothing to Envy. They had nothing to corroborate, but never mind the fact that they couldn't corroborate it. Forget about that. He was sure that this was a camp. And through intelligence circles, this eventually became materialized as Camp 25. And he said it was verified by one defector who once went there, not having known about before, but when it was materialized, oh, yeah, who once went there to visit a friend who served at some point as a guard there. Okay, and so, and then what happened was through this amplified mapping of Camp 25, there was laid on defector intelligence. So one of the buildings that he thought was just a building was actually suddenly a crematorium. Okay, so I just want to speak to you about like how these kinds of sites get materialized into being. And yeah, it's not just that mapping has historically been a colonial technology which is inextricable from practices of conquest, from seizure, from enclosure. But we can see how through technological means there is an active practice of the deterritorialization of North Korea from without.
Thank you, Christine. We realize that we are almost at time, but if we can beg your understanding and take a few questions, and then if there are additional questions, we might be able to incorporate that into our second session. But maybe we can go 5-10 minutes.
So thank you for this great session. And also, the session started late, so it's perfectly legitimate, right, to take 7 or 10 more minutes. So I just have a question which is very uninformed, but it pertains to what would a post-Korean War world or society look like? Right? What would then be the outcome or the product? Where would we head?
Maybe we could take a few questions and then answer them together.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed it. My question is for Christine. So you explore this concept of seeing as destroying, and that can be extended in perception as a form of construction. Do you think destruction is the end or the means or potentially both? And how can we think about the construction of things like an axis of evil as a move towards a perpetual state of exception and destruction as definite, final, and end? And then a second question, if you have time, So in thinking about the desire to uncover or penetrate the North Korean black hole, what do you think this reveals about the imperial affective disposition that is in search of seeing North Korea? Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a bunch of questions, so I'll just say briefly. I think one of the things, Professor Hong, that you mentioned at the beginning was about building on Fanon and working against bewilderment. But I think you also mentioned that your conversation together reflected on how little you had been taught about the Korean War from the start, right? So I guess I wonder how you think about the project of teaching people who seem just sort of generally, the political education in a field that people seem generally unfamiliar with in a lot of cases. Is that lack of familiarity in this case an opportunity because there are fewer inherited narratives? Like, how are you thinking about the what your students come in knowing and how to sort of engage with that?
I can try to take the first question, I guess. What will the post-Korean War society look like? And I'm currently at an institution that's sort of well known for its international relations, and we're located in the greater DC area, right? That kind of focuses on can we have peace with North Korea? Can we draw up a peace treaty? But I think some of the questions that our collective bring together, both in our modules and in our discussion, is that we have to sort of look at the question of ending the Korean War and reunification even with North Korea in terms of the structures of the Korean Wars that are far lasting beyond something that can merely be resolved through diplomatic negotiations or through reconciliation on a state level of any kind. Because if you sort of think about where North Korean diaspora is within the United States, for instance, right? So when I was a graduate student at UCLA in LA, you meet North Korean people at the bottom strata of the Korean American society here, for instance. There are the exfoliators in public bathhouses that are owned and run by Korean Americans. And you only have to look to also within South Korea of the stark racism and discrimination that North Korean refugees face within South Korea, along with a lot of other Korean ethnic minorities in China who also try to make a living in Korea. So what will happen if unification actually happens, which will probably happen under the terms of a dominating South Korean force is that the structures will continue, and it's an incorporation of North Korea and North Koreans into a U.S.-led capitalist world order in which South Korea is perpetuating its structural violence against, right? But these are the kind of questions that we don't ask at the diplomatic level or others. So this is some of the ways. I'm not saying that this is what will happen, but these are kind of discussions that we need to address. So.
Yeah, and if maybe I can turn to Chris's question about sort of the forgotten war presenting an opportunity. I think in some ways it is an opportunity in the sense that you can fill in gaps, but what I think is something that's come out during this session for me is that despite sort of the overall kind of history of the war being forgotten, I think there's still sort of very strong sort of ideological sort of baggage that comes with the Korean War, right? There is very much this idea that the North Koreans invaded the South, right? And it was sort of a critical sort of turning point in the Cold War, right? And I think sort of on a more personal level, that North Korea is bad, South Korea is good, right? I think a lot of sort of Korean Americans have faced that question growing up, like, are you a good Korean or a bad Korean, right? So I think in some ways, the opportunity is not just to fill in wholesale what the Korean War is, but sort of provide additional context. And I think in that way, like having those sort of kind of pieces, if you will, does, I think, present sort of important ways in which to accomplish what we were talking about, right? Sort of thinking about the war on a more intimate register, right? So those human stories are really what makes those really kind of powerful associations with the Korean War and the Koreas themselves, I think, compelling and interesting to people who otherwise sort of would not have a connection to the war itself directly.
Just to kind of piggyback off Patrick's comment, so I think it was a year or two ago that I was on an Uber, and this Uber driver asked me where I was from, and I had to explain. I was like, yes, I'm Korean, but I'm from Argentina. And he's like, which Korea? And I said, South Korea, the good Korea. And he's like, oh, you guys really need to thank the U.S. because if it wasn't for the U.S., you would be a communist. And this Uber driver, it's not like he had a history lesson in the Korean War, but he obviously very much had a framework within which, again, as you said, North Korea bad, South Korea good, but also the U.S. is savior, right? The U.S. is Superman. So I think one of the things that we are talking about when we think about the pedagogy of the Korean War is that even despite the lack of knowledge, if you want to put about the Korean War, there's a way in which affectively, theoretically, and pedagogically, we have established certain frameworks, right, in which we function. Right? And we can even see this in like an Avenger movies, right? So I think precisely when we talk about the Korean War as unending and permanent, we're not just talking about just one historical event, but the way that this branches out in multiple ways, right? In our quotidian life, right? So people who think they're not affected by the Korean War, they have nothing to do with it. They precisely are, right? So I think this is one of the ways we're talking about in terms of like, what is the pedagogical function that we're trying to do in this political education, right?
Let's see, how would I answer that first question? The way, at least the past 20 years, when you look at U.S. defense contracts, when you look at the accelerated deployment of U.S. Weapons systems, when you read the language, there's a phrase that appears. It's that this is in response to an armed, and then later on, a nuclear-armed North Korea. And so the kind of specter of North Korea as boogeyman has been extraordinarily generative for the military-industrial complex, for the U.S. war machine. And it has sort of knit regions and much of the international order into an alignment with the United States. And so I guess like one of the questions that I have is the sort of after time really an after? Or do we think about, Grace Lee Boggs talked about prefiguration, and how do we not have that kind of structuring political goal, X, Y, or Z liberation, as like the only way of assessing our own sort of political process? And how instead do we enact what we are working toward here? So it's a kind of question, and I think that I'm moved by the fact that, did you know that there was a delegation from Jeju Island to Nanjing because the Japanese Imperial Army went from Jeju to Nanjing, and that delegation apologized. People who you can't actually understand in a position of domination and not in a position of accountability, the same accountability as the Japanese Empire, apologized. What's interesting is there was a group from Port Radium of native Dene elders who went from Port Radium in Canada and went to Hiroshima, and they actually met with Korean hibakusha. They apologized. They themselves were irradiated by being exposed to this mining. So I think it's also interesting to think about someone like Julian Guåhan, the Chamorro lawyer who works with the Marshallese, and he has stated that Guam is, the people of the Chamorro people are routinely enjoined to fear North Korea and to understand themselves as a potential target. But he said, North Korea is not the enemy of the Chamorro people. China is not the enemy of the Chamorro people. And so instead of understanding or naturalizing those relations of enmity, he has stated that for the peoples who are tied into relations of amplifying imperialist violence toward targets, right? That there's a relationship of solidarity that's possible, and it's enactable now. And he says that solidarity isn't our best bet, it's our only one. And I would love to speak with you about your questions later, but I hesitate to take up too much more time right now. Yes, Shelby, go ahead.
All right. I think we might sort of put a pause on the conversation there. Like I said, there will be a second session that will talk a little bit more broadly about some of these themes in sort of a more practical context. So we're going to have a collection of academics, students, and activists in our second session that begins at 6:30. But until then, I'd really like to invite you all to enjoy the reception. It's going to be Korean food from a local Korean restaurant. So please just make your way across this green, and the building is Tolliver, and if you enter it, turn directly right and go to the end of the hall. That's where the reception will be. Thank you so much for coming. Hope to see you at the second session.